My name is Matt Germer. I'm the director of the governance program here at R Street. And I have the enviable position of bringing us back from lunch. Hopefully now we've all got clear plates, full bellies, can't lose. And we'll enjoy a nice conversation here on the presidency, polarization of political parties, and public trust in government. I'm joined today by Professor Sidney Milkis of the University of Virginia. Professor Milkis is the white Burkett, the white Burkett Miller Professor in the Department of Politics. Importantly to me and to all of us out there who attended undergrad at some point, Professor Milkis has received numerous awards for being a great teacher to undergraduates, which I think is underappreciated in academia. And I want to recognize him for that. He's also the author of multiple books. His most recently available one is What Happened to the Vital Center, Presidentialism, Populist Revolt, and the Fracturing of America. You go ahead and order that one now, but get it done quick because he's got a new one coming out next month called Subverting Democracy, Donald J. Trump and the Perils of Presidentialism. Professor Milkis, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to go through, as evident by our topic today, a few different categories of discussion. And the first we'll get started with is the presidency. There's been so much conversation for years that it's almost a cliche that we've seen the centralization of authority in the executive in this country. And maybe a great place for us to get started in our conversation is to look back in time. When did this begin? Is this something we have to, we look back 100 years? Is this FDR? Is it Wilson? Is it Teddy Roosevelt? Is it George Washington? Where does the story begin?
All of those. I don't. With some indulgence for history, George Washington is important. He's sort of the founding president, and what's important about George Washington is the idea of having a Republican executive is revolutionary. The view of executive power coming out of the Revolution and given the kind of roots of American politics emphasizing individualism is a dread of centralized executive power. And the first Constitution in the United States, 1781 to 1787, should I give a quiz, see how many people know? The Articles of Confederation didn't even have what we would call an executive power. All the power was concentrated in the congressional, in the Congress, and in the states. Mm-hmm. And a lot of power was in the states. So there was a huge debate about whether there could really be a Republican executive at the Constitutional Convention, our first really period of polarization in the United States between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And Washington and his allies, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, won that debate in a very close contest. So we do get a Republican executive. And the hope is that it can overcome some of the anarchy that erupted in the Articles of Confederation because due to almost the absence of any kind of centralized power. Establishing any kind of authority in America has been a challenge from the beginning, particularly the beginning. So Washington has a real challenge to deal with that dread, and he's the right person to do it because he was a revolutionary war hero. He's a symbol of nationalism in America. And he does this delicate, he establishes a delicate balance between establishing the authority of the president, particularly in upholding the law and in national security. So we had a whiskey rebellion in 1794. I'm from Pennsylvania. I understand whiskey rebellion. Yes. The four most western counties in Pennsylvania were rebelling against the whiskey tax. Whiskey was almost a currency at this time. And Washington thought this is where he had to act aggressively. Mm-hmm. And so he mounted a horse and led 13,000 militia from 4 states to put down the rebellion. He's the only president to have done that in American history. Sometimes when I want to keep my students up after lunch when I teach, I ask them to imagine Donald Trump.
On a horse, yeah. I think I've seen AI-generated imagery with that in mind.
So Washington is important in establishing the notion we could have a strong executive who was not a king. And one more thing to say about Washington that really sealed the deal was we had no term limits in the original Constitution. Mm-hmm. If he really wanted to be an elected monarch, Washington could have been, but he withdrew after 2 terms voluntarily. And that really filled the country with awe, because it was really rare in Western history, Western civilization, for a powerful leader to give up authority voluntarily. But Washington knew that to be a strong leader in a republic, you had to be willing to give power up.
That's a great point, and maybe for many of us in this room, we're already starting to recite lyrics from Hamilton in our heads, thinking of King George's song around that. Yeah, I won't agree. But I guess this then leads to the question of where do we start to look for the foundations of how we really understand the modern presidency. One thing, as you mentioned, in George Washington as an executive, as a military leader, as a decisive actor, he wasn't necessarily the originator of the policy agenda for the country, at least nowhere near to the extent that right now, when we say we need to fix America's problems, our eyes turn to the president rather than to Congress. So where did that begin?
Washington, except when it came to foreign affairs and domestic peace, really left everything to Congress, including the Bill of Rights, the first 10 Amendments. So after Washington, we do get some strong exercise of presidential power during the major inflection points of American history. So most people here know the list. Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Franklin, Roosevelt, and some people say Reagan. We could talk about that. But presidential power is episodic. And when those inflection points end in a political order with a consensus, presidential power is constrained once again. Where I'll just mention this, you could follow up, where the presidency becomes, strong presidential power becomes routine rather than episodic, is with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal political order. That's when we get the consolidation of what political scientists call the modern executive. And that is a response to things like the Industrial Revolution, which hit the country like a gale force at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, are getting involved in foreign affairs, which begins with the Spanish-American War, but then we have 2 world wars. And so those major developments push power towards Washington, Washington, D.C., and the president leads to a nationalization of American politics. And that privileges the president because as Jefferson, you always have to mention Jefferson if you're from the University of Virginia at a public event. As Jefferson put it, only the president sees the whole ground. But that didn't really become an important ideology in America until Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal.
And so you bring up FDR, and this creates a certain kind of image in my mind of maybe the peaks of presidential power, and then as you talk about, either it plateaus, it just doesn't increase for a certain amount of time, or perhaps even wanes, where once FDR becomes president, for one, he's not only a president for life, effectively at that point, but also a new Congress came in the time that he was president that was following him, right? He's now the leader of the party, the leader of the policy agenda, finding a Congress and a court who will go along with his vision for the country. But that again gets to this, presidentialism or presidential centralization of power goes up. Then does it plateau and then go? Is it a ratchet effect, or have we seen in history presidential authority increase and then wane for a period? And I'll prompt you with the follow-up as you start to think through this. In the periods where it has waned, why? Or if it has, and if it hasn't, what does that? If it's only a one-way ratchet, what does that mean for our country?
Yeah, well, there have been 2 major periods that have waned. They're both before the New Deal revolution. One is in the late 1890s after Reconstruction implodes. There's a tremendous reaction to presidential power. Really have Woodrow Wilson, who was a political scientist, by the way, the only political scientist to become president. I don't know what that tells us about political scientists becoming president, called congressional government. The other major reaction is during the Progressive era, when you get the inklings of a modern presidency, or the beginnings of it, with Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. This is when you get the bully pulpit, the beginnings of the regulatory state. But because of Wilson's excessive use of power during World War I, it's not just an accident that the Civil Liberties Union is established in 1918. Because of that, there's a tremendous reaction in 1920, which Warren Harding, who's elected in 1920, calls the return to normalcy. The real word was normality, but Warren Harding felt normalcy sound. He was a newspaper man who understood marketing And he thought
Sure.
normalcy rolled off the tongue better. And so there is the three Republican presidents before Roosevelt, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, are much more restrained, and they're constrained not only because they believe in a limited presidency, but also by the Republican Party.
So that's what I was hoping to get to as part of this. And man, we could go in so many directions with this, because you mentioned Hoover in the same breath as Calvin Coolidge, and it just doesn't necessarily feel aligned, because Hoover probably would have taken whatever power was given to him if he had that opportunity. But
he
and
didn't
Harding,
take it during the Depression, which is interesting.
and so what sticks out, I guess, as part of this is who drove that desire to have the presidency be more restrained? Was it the individuals themselves who held a belief about what the president should be? Was it their parties and Congress who were demanding that power back and effectuating that? Was it the people? I mean, a return to normalcy as a campaign slogan, to me, indicates that it's a response to the people who are looking to bring things back to a pre-war state. Or is it a combination of all three?
Yeah, it's probably a combination of all three. I mean, Harding won 60% of the popular vote in 1920, so there was a real reaction to the progressive era capped by World War I. Some pundit said Americans were tired of being reformed. And so the idea of returning to normalcy was an attractive thing. There's also the Republican Party, which stems from the old Whig tradition. It grew out of the Whig Party, which believed in limiting executive power. And it's not really till the Nixon presidency that Republicans view the modern executive as a double-edged sword ideologically that could cut in a progressive as a liberal direction. So the Republican Party up through the late 1960s is really a party committed to limited government. But also those presidents are restrained. If I may, I just want to mention one factoid which I found fascinating. One of the good things about doing research, you find things that surprise you. So during World War I, there was an act passed called the Sedition Act. It was enacted in 1918, and it basically made it illegal to criticize the government or to criticize the war effort. Eugene Debs, who was a very important socialist and actually the leader of the Socialist Party at the time of its peak in American history, he won 6% of the vote in 1912, which is the most votes that a socialist candidate has ever gotten in American history. And he makes an anti-war speech. He's convicted by the Sedition Act, sentenced to 10 years in jail. And Woodrow Wilson is asked, do you really want to put this guy in jail for we're progressive, you're progressive.
Right.
And Wilson says, he's a traitor. He's a traitor. There's no way I'm going to pardon him. But Wilson believed in a kind of nationalism that could be repressive of individual liberties. So Warren Harding comes in, and in 1921, his Attorney General, Harry Doherty, suggests that he pardon Eugene Debs because he was put in jail basically for expressing a foundational American liberty. And I love the story because Warren Harding pardons Eugene Debs. And so whereas the progressive locked Debs up for 10 years, Warren Harding, the conservative, pardons a socialist. And these days, if I can just jump to the present just for a second, I did an event at the Miller Center, which is at the University of Virginia, last Thursday, and traditional conservatives who believe in limited government and believe that government obligation is to cultivate liberty, are really hungry for a kind of traditional conservatism, which seems really beleaguered.
So
right
maybe
now.
this gets us...
So I tell them, read about Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge.
Which is great. Just don't...
None of them have taken me up on that, but that's...
Don't dig into Harding and Teapot Dome and his mistresses and whether or not the conspiracy is true that he was actually murdered by...
No,
some tinfoil out there for it.
I think it was food poisoning,
Allegedly.
Yeah.
But this actually leads to a good question around kind of where we stand now in this picture.
Do we have to go here now?
But I do think it is helpful.
They just had their lunch.
But I do think it is helpful in that context. Again, trying to ground it in the history of the presidency. Yeah. We've mentioned already Wilson and FDR, who had very expansive views of what the president should be able to do. And if I know we're in the now, but if we define now as maybe the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Where would you say we stand as a country in kind of the arc of presidential power And perhaps we find some level of agreement that the moment we are in, literally as we sit here today, might be the peak of what we've seen over the last 20 years. But how would you characterize the modern moment?
I think where we are now is in a very dangerous place, because what we've seen is a combination, a merging of executive prerogative, executive aggrandizement, a very powerful presidency, in the context of a kind of deep, really polarizing partisanship, where each tribe views each other not just as the opposition, but as an existential threat to their way of life. And this is a departure from the New Deal political order, which I would trace up to the late 1960s. The New Deal political order was basically about domestic and international security. Roosevelt's famous Four Freedoms speech is the charter of the New Deal. Freedom from want says there's no individual liberty for necessitous men and women. So that is embodied by the welfare state. And then freedom from fear means that the United States has to be protected from imperial powers abroad. That becomes embodied by the national security state, extended with some controversy to homeland security after September 11th. Those freedoms, Roosevelt argues, have to supplement, as he put it, our more traditional freedoms like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So those are the four freedoms. That's the charter. That leads to a conflict between New Deal liberalism and conservatism. But it's over matters of security. And a fair amount of consensus is established in the wake of the New Deal. Eisenhower, the first Republican president elected after the consolidation of the New Deal political order, really bestows bipartisan legitimacy on the New Deal.
Ratifies it of sorts,
a moderate view of the welfare state.
Right.
In fact, expands Social Security and supports national security against the pressures of the more isolationist, more traditional conservatives in the Republican Party, like Robert Taft. So that really, the post-war years, even though there certainly is partisan conflict, executive power really isn't drawn into the vortex of toxic partisanship, as happens in the late 1960s. And there's this understanding about the modern presidency, and it comes, Theodore Roosevelt's kind of beguiling term helps us understand it, that the president must become the steward of the public welfare. That is, even as the president's a partisan leader, he or she, we should say she optimistically, he or she also has an obligation, particularly during moments of crises, to stand above partisanship. I think, Matt, that begins to change in the late 60s with the cosmic crack-up of the 1960s. When I teach the 60s to my students, and many of the people here in the audience are pretty much of the generation of my students, it sounds like ancient history to them. When I talk about Lyndon Johnson, it's like I brought the man from Mars down to discuss them. But I lived through the 60s, and I've studied it a lot, and I think it's a really important moment. And it's a moment that reverberates through our own political time. And what happens is matters of security become tied to and sometimes subordinated to the kind of cultural issues that explode in the 1960s. These polarizing issues, like what is the meaning of patriotism? Battles over civil rights, battles over immigration, battles over sexual equality, battles over things like reproductive rights. Those are much more polarizing issues than issues of security. You can cut the difference in Social Security. It's much more difficult to cut the difference on an issue like abortion. And so this polarizes the country and leads ultimately to a period of partisan gridlock or hyper-partisanship. And both in the face of that partisan gridlock, both parties look to the presidency to be, if I can use kind of a monarchical term, to be their Alexander Great, who can cut through the Gordian knot, through this partisan gridlock, and satisfy their partisan and advance their partisan objectives. So we have a development of a kind of executive-centered partisanship where presidents perform many of the duties that were previously performed by parties as collective independent organizations. One of the most important is the use of unilateral executive power to advance objectives.
Well, I guess...
And I would just say as a final word, this really culminates with, I think, the Obama presidency, the Biden presidency, and the Trump presidency.
And so I guess this sticks out to me now as a way to maybe pivot to our next bigger subject around polarization. As you just referred to, the president now represents the parties. The current president really is the leader of the in-party. If there is a past president that is still in the public eye, perhaps they could represent the out-party. Though at present, I would not characterize Joe Biden as being the leader of the Democratic Party. He's kind of taken an extended vacation.
Well, in the first debate, he said, "I am the Democratic Party." He did say for a time.
For a time. But it gets to a conversation around where is the center of our politics. And as you referred to, maybe it started in the LBJ and Nixon 60s and 70s being the president, but now it is almost exclusively the president. I think most Americans would have a hard time naming their member of Congress.
Yeah.
And many Americans would have a hard time naming their governor or let alone any other like state legislative figure or city councilman or anything on that level, or state party chair. Or those types of figures.
Or national party chair.
Or national party chair, of course. Yeah. So I guess, when we think about the way that we've seen centralization of power into the president, how has that manifested, how does that play a role in our polarization more broadly? Because now you have a figure to either rally behind or against.
Yeah. I think one of the perils of presidentialism is that it creates a winner-take-all politics. There's no, when Congress was an important institution, and I guess I shouldn't put it in the past tense. In some ways it probably isn't. We could talk about that. Still an important institution, but it certainly lost a lot of its power. It's completely delegated its power to declare war, which it seems to me is a pretty
long list.
And it's in the process of delegating its power to control the purse. So those are its two fundamental powers. But when you had a strong Congress, when the states did a lot, the state legislatures, American politics wasn't a winner-take-all proposition. It was a pluralistic, kind of pragmatic politics. But with these centralizing cultural issues, the president playing such an important part in agitating them, then we have a kind of winner-take-all politics. So, the culmination of this kind of pathology of presidentialism was January 6th, 2021. We had an insurrection. No, we didn't have an insurrection after the 2018 election, even though the Democrats had picked up 40 seats in the House and taken over the House of Representatives. The presidency is really now viewed as the prize of American politics. And presidential action, the proverbial use of the presidential pen, drives American politics. Now, one caveat to that, because I think there is a top-down, bottom-up dynamic to this, is that coming out of the 60s, we get these movement politics, where social movements on both the right and the left become much more important. So think of the civil rights activists on the left. Think of the Christian right activists on the right. And party organizations are weakened beginning in, really it begins in the early part of the 20th century, but especially we get these party reforms, which weakens the party organizations after 1968. When the McGovern-Fraser reforms, we take away the power of the National Convention and we create this primary. So party organizations become weak. That void is filled by social activists, and they form this uneasy but formative relationship with the presidency. And the presidency is not unattracted to this idea, because this is, it's hard to become president if you're not ambitious. Even Joe Biden was pretty damn ambitious. And so they see these social activists and the way they can drive transformative change as an important way of establishing their place in history, their place in politics. And the reason why I think, Matt, it's important to understand this as top-down, bottom-up, is let's think about Joe Biden for a second. Joe Biden had his whole career in Congress. He was a president who seemed to understand forbearance, some restraint. He seemed to believe in the rule of law, and 4 important laws are passed during his presidency, 2 with bipartisan support. But when pressured by activists, he also used unilateral executive action aggressively, even though he knew there weren't strong legal foundations for that. I think the best example of that is his executive order to provide student debt relief, which would have come, if it had not been stopped by the courts, would have come at the cost of $300 billion to the federal government. So I think it's not just presidents usurping power.
Right.
There's churning at the grassroots level that contributes, I think, to the exercise of this presidential
And I suppose that leads to some level of question of the president as a leader and helping to set that agenda, and then the people follow, or a president who feels like they need to be responding to the people and to the activist groups. And man, it's hard for me to sit here as a man who's spent his career on the right and think, man, I got more of a list for Joe Biden for you if you want more examples of overstepping authority. But I'll do my best. I'll be restrained. I'll be restrained.
Take up the rest of the lunch.
But I guess what sticks out to me is you've mentioned now that parties as organizations have lost some of their luster over the years, whether it's coming from the reforms we saw in the 60s and the advent of primary elections, whether it's, I would argue the changes we saw in campaign finance that makes it more difficult for them to raise and spend money directly. But when we think about polarization now, and even in the title of our talk here today around the polarization of the parties, how should we be thinking about parties? You mentioned parties as an organization. That's one way, I think, to think about them. Parties could also be collections of politicians who then govern the caucuses and conferences. Parties could be the voters themselves, which I think is often how many people envision parties. Getting back to, they can't name their state chair, but they can, when they say the Republicans believe X, Y, or Z, they either are referring to polling that they've seen, so the people, or they might be referring to statements they've been hearing from electeds. So how should we think of parties? And I guess as we think about those different definitions of what a party could be, are they all equally affected by polarization, or are they differently affected based upon how we define the term?
Yeah, these questions Matt asking me remind me of my PhD oral exams. I'm not sure they're great questions to probe at an after lunch, but they're great questions. So when I think of parties as qua parties, and I love political parties. My grandfather, who migrated from the Ukraine when it was controlled by Russia, very early, as a very young man, got involved in the Republican Party, which dominated Philadelphia at that time. And he was a committeeman. He canvassed neighborhoods. That's when parties were parties. Yeah. They were collective organizations with a past and a future that had a really strong personal connection to the people in neighborhoods and cities and states. But over time, and we're seeing a culmination of this now, parties have been greatly weakened by organizations. They came to be viewed as an obstacle to progress, beginning in the progressive era, but playing out to reaching a culmination now. People want to be engaged in a kind of transformative politics rather than kind of pragmatic compromising politics. Those kind of decentralized catch-all parties seem to provide. And so what we've seen is this paradox. My students have trouble understanding this, but I sat here for the panel before lunch, and these people are really smart, and they'll get this. But this paradox is we've weakened, party organizations have grown much weaker. Think of the national conventions. They just ratified the decisions. There's no peer review by parties anymore. But partisanship has become more intense. That's because partisanship is dominated by this uneasy but formidable relationship between executive power and political activists. And so now basically the parties don't really have integrity as collective organizations with a past and a future. We saw this a bit with the Obama presidency, where the Democratic Party became a little bit of a cult of personality. Donald Trump has brought this to a really, really, I think, astonishing culmination. That from 2015 to the present, he has completely captured the Republican Party. Now, some of this is a continuation from the Reagan presidency. There are some commitments that continue, in particular, the commitment to sustaining traditional values, traditional rights. Reagan really enlisted the Christian right into the Republican Party. But in many ways, it's a departure, as I was suggesting at the beginning of our conversation, from what people would call traditional conservatism, a belief in limited government. And so Trump has completely taken over the apparatus of the Republican Party. Virtually every state Republican Party is a Trump party now, even in blue states like Massachusetts.
Right.
And also he took over the Republican National Committee, where his daughter-in-law is the co-chair.
I suppose you're referring very specifically to a takeover as far as like the who is in charge, but I think maybe even worth recognizing that they didn't approve a party platform in 2020.
Yeah.
Some of the basic functions of a party to set an agenda have changed, because now the agenda is, what is it that our leader wants? Let's create an agenda around that, rather than maybe being a reflection of what is it that our voters are looking for. How can we then impress the leadership to follow the voters?
I'm sorry, I don't want
No,
to
please.
But if I can, this is the problem of interviewing a professor. They got stuff to say. And I've been saying this stuff for 30 years. So the other thing I wanted to say is one of the reasons, it's not just mechanical, one of the reasons that Trump has been able to take over the apparatus of the Republican Party is because of this, and I don't fully understand it, the primordial relationship he has with the base of the Republican Party. So, this movement politics has led to a kind of base partisanship where there's no longer so much an appeal to the center as there is an effort to grow the base. And Donald Trump has brought this to a head. He sees himself really as a factional leader, as a divider rather than a unifier. But he has this kind of religious connection to the base that I've never seen in the presidency before.
Yeah.
And I think to understand why his relationship with his party is not transactional, and we'll have to see how far that goes with what's happening with things like the economy right now. But they accept almost everything he does as being the right thing. And I think you have to go to what the great sociologist Max Weber called a charismatic leader. That the relationship between a charismatic leader and his or her following is not a transactional relationship. It's a religious relationship. And Trump's moral deficiencies may seem to ill-suit him for that role, but he's brilliantly tapped into it. He presented a meme of himself as the Pope the other day.
Or apparently a Sith Lord, which was
also
also
my Catholic
confusing.
wife was really pissed at that.
But it's a great point, and maybe there's some element of quibbling that I wish if we had hours we could go through so much.
We
of
could
this,
do that. We'll just serve dessert.
That's a great plan. But because there really is, I think, something to be said about how we even think of the base of the party changed. Because I would even argue that the really rabid supporters of Donald Trump within the Republican Party may not even reflect the base of the party. So many of them are new Republicans. Yeah. And they are joining because of him and because of the leadership that they want from him. Whereas you could argue the base Republicans are the Reagan Republicans, the one who've been voting up and down the ballot for Republicans for decades, and who maybe don't feel like they're being catered to, but they can be taken for granted as a Republican vote. That, in many ways, is the base. So then you can spend your time trying to grow your coalition, in this case, through those who like the AI memes and who like the rallies and the rest. But man, we really could do that. I want to see if we can. We only have a limited amount of time left for us, and we can pivot to our third topic.
Right time flies, so you're having fun.
I'd talk a little bit about public trust in government. I think, again, it's a bit of a cliche for those of us in this space that trust has been in decline. And it's not exclusive to government. Trust in institutions has been in decline for decades. This is not a recent beginning of a trend. We've been in this for years. I'm curious, from your vantage point, what has led to the erosion of trust? I guess we'll limit our world to the erosion of trust in government, and to the extent to which presidential behavior and presidentialism plays a role in that erosion of trust.
I put a graph up to show my class a couple weeks ago that showed the long history of trust in government. And it's really very high after World War II, and it begins to decline in 1965. And there've been some interruptions in that decline, but basically there's been what political scientists call a secular decline since then, and it's extremely low now. I didn't check the most recent verdict, but it's down around the 20s, low 20s, I believe. And I think I'm always reluctant to say how many causative factors, because then I might forget to say the second or third.
Sure.
But I think one of the reasons is that what happens in 1965, government gets to be involved in every aspect of our life. That starts with the New Deal. Security is very important. But when you extend it to these identity issues, the question of what it means to be an American, that makes politics very personal. I think one of the credos of the second feminist wave movement in the 1960s is the personal is the political. Mm-hmm. And that kind of politics comes out of the 1960s. So that leads to a situation where people begin to have less faith in government because of how involved it gets in their lives. That's one. But what makes it even more combustible and problematic is even as they lose trust in government, they still want government to do a lot of things.
Right.
So one of the things that evolves from 60 civics is this combination of wanting government to do a lot even as you trust it less. And that's why we've come to rely so much on the courts to adjudicate many of the most important controversies that come out of the 1960s. The other thing is...
Although I guess what's notable there is something like Brown v. Board takes a decade to actually take effect. So even then, the courts have this kind of slow ability to try to correct, and even that, I guess you could argue when the decision was made, it was ahead of culture. Yeah. And it took culture a decade to catch up on that front.
And when it moves to busing, that's when it really hits home. The other thing I think that makes this combustible combination so problematic is the development of polarization, where we divide into tribes. So as I said before, the Democrats now view Republicans not just as the opposition, but as an existential threat to their way of life. And Republicans want to own the libs. They hate woke politics. And they view Democrats as an existential threat to their lives. And so that just aggravates this lack of trust that comes out of the 1960s. And so it's really interesting what happens to the presidency during this. So the president plays such an important role in this politics. So we have this situation where both the Democrats and Republicans love presidential power. They love the presidency. But half the country hates the president.
Right.
and that is a really, shall we call that a conundrum? That is a conundrum which I see as one of the real challenges going forward if we're going to restore trust in American politics.
So maybe we can move to something that might be more optimistic, since this has been somewhat of a downer for the last 45 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry, guys.
But we can't control it.
We can go back and talk more about George Washington or Lincoln if you want.
Well, maybe this is where I'm going. So we have a unique opportunity here in the next 14 months to recognize the 250th anniversary of our country, and we should all get familiar with saying semi-quincentennial. If you can't do the whole mouthful, the semi-quin
I'm going to need a drink
is good enough. But we do really have this opportunity to reflect upon our founding, which I think has a lot of really interesting value, and we can pull a lot from that. But we can also reflect upon how far we have come since our founding. These anniversaries are not just about that moment in the past, but also about where we are in the present and where we can go in the future. And I think that there's an opportunity here in the next 14 months for an American identity to be celebrated, whatever that might be. We get our own opportunities to discuss what that means and what it is that we can rally around. And hopefully, at least in my vision, we all have different identities for ourselves. And maybe it's a parent or a spouse, or a sibling, or a child, and as you work your way through your identity, somewhere along the way you've got American, somewhere along the way you've probably got your partisan identity, to really lean into that American identity as being a higher order identity. But it seems so tough. It seems so tough sitting here now, 14 months out, to think about how we as a country could unite in this period. So I guess this gives us an opportunity to reflect back on previous anniversaries of this country, major anniversaries, whether that's the centennial in 1876, a time that was filled with strife in this country, in the midst of Reconstruction,
yes.
And the country trying to sew itself back together, and in the lead up to perhaps the most divisive presidential election in our history. 1860 might beat it out, but it's actually led to a fracture. But for those who've been following the Electoral Reform Act the discussions we've had over the last few years, we have that because of 1876. And so, as we come toward a 250, are there lessons that we can pull from 1876 or 1926 or 1976 and look back and say, we were in the midst of turmoil, but we somehow came together?
I'm only giggling, not because that isn't a great question, but I see a sign that says 3 minutes. I was hoping I'd have 14 months to answer this. So during these centennials, as dark as they sometimes were, so what we got? We got 1876, 1926, 1976, and coming.
Yes.
So all these periods have been periods of conflict, division. Matter of fact, I think American history has been full of conflict over this question of who are we the people. But what I've noticed, because you told me to think about this, is in looking back at some of these celebrations, is there has always been an emphasis on what holds America together rather than what divides it. And so in the 1876 one, when there was still great respect for the states, the celebration, the commemoration was really to take place. It says the celebration should take place in towns and counties and cities. And the celebration in Philly, the center of it, celebrated the states. Many states built their own expositions rather than the national government. The president, Ulysses S. Grant, didn't say a thing at that. And so there was a celebration of local self-government, an important part of American politics, which for better and worse is revitalized. In 1926, where we're beginning to be divided by the Industrial Revolution, there is a celebration of the prosperity brought by the development of an industrial capitalism in the United States. Calvin Coolidge is the president there.
And he gave one of the greatest July 4th speeches. If you haven't read it,
so I did read it.
Fantastic.
It is very good. And what he stresses there is the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
And how our rights are natural. They're not given to us by government. And this is challenging the idea of progressivism. And if rights are natural, that puts limits on government. And prosperity is our idealism in practicality. Cutting taxes is practical idealism, and this is what has made us prosperous. And he said it's what can make us a great nation, because if we're wealthy, then we can pursue higher order things. And Calvin Coolidge was really into public education. Yes, I think his wife was a teacher before she went as First Lady. And then the 1976 one is Gerald Ford, who's a moderate Republican, and trying to take account of all this progress that has been made in periods like the 60s, the Civil Rights Revolution, which he supported. And what he said makes us great is this never-ending pursuit of a more perfect union, or in the Declaration, never-ending pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which Lincoln says is our founding document, not the Constitution. He says, what distinguishes us from places like Russia is we can identify the failings in living up to the Declaration of Independence, and at the same time believe we can do something about them. Right. There's so many of my students now who feel the political system is irrevocably damaged and fractured, and we can't make progress. We're a racist society. We're an intractably, religiously intolerant society. And the great thing about Gerald Ford, it is quite good, is that he says that we can make progress because there is a fabric to the American political tradition that holds us together, on which we can fight and move forward. And he says that's the Declaration of Independence. And so America, I think what is really celebrated at these, whatever you call them, these every 200,
centennials,
every 150 years, and I don't know if this will happen in 2026, is that we are a country built on an ideal, not on soil, not on the homeland. And that's what distinguishes us. And as Gerald Ford said, that's why people come here in search of freedom. People who go to France can't become citizens. People who come to the United States, like my grandfather, can become citizens. So we'll have to see what happens in 2026. I'm sure wrap and breathe.
Well, we are getting our cues, but that is really, I think, an uplifting place to think. Like, we are heading into a celebration of this country, And if you might have your frustrations about the current moment, you can look back and think about how much we have progressed in the time that we have been a country. And that should give some hope and optimism for how much further we can move forward, creating a more perfect union into the future. So with that, thank you, Professor Milkis, for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.